currently live. Cheers for coming on today, man. How you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I didn't have much sleep last night, so I probably look like total shit. But what
well,
can
I heard
you do?
You said you were doing a fitness class this morning, so that's.
That's what I mean. So I've got up early, gone and done the fitness class and that, and now I'm just like I could do with a nap, but it's all cool, So tell me a bit about your background. Obviously, introduce yourself to people that may not know who you are and what you do, and then we'll go from there.
Yes, well, I sort of started to investigate things, under the veneer of reality, if you whatever expression you want to, use. I started intensive investigations back in 2003. That was really when I kicked off big time with it. Started devoting a lot of my time, and I'd always been interested in sort of UFOs and a few things to do with what are called conspiracies, which has become a bit of a dirty word. But I always had this interest, for example, in more than a passing interest in the JFK assassination, because there's some coincidences relating to that, which I was actually told about by my history teacher when I was about 14. And Kennedy had a secretary called Lincoln, and Lincoln had a secretary called Kennedy, and both Lincoln and Kennedy were shot from behind, apparently, and Lee Harvey Oswald, who didn't shoot Kennedy but was framed, he was born in 1939, and John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. And there's several things like that. And then, of course, the presidents that followed Kennedy were both called Johnson. The president that followed Lincoln was Andrew Johnson, my namesake, so that's kind of a connection. And my birth date is 2211, which I was born exactly a year after Kennedy was assassinated. So that's been a sort of like a bit of a weird connection for me into that side of things. But in 2003, I was got a broadband connection here. We got some of the early broadband sort of links. And I was looking for information on this Rendlesham UFO incident, which happened in 1980 when a number of officers went off base in Rendlesham, Suffolk, went to see this object which had apparently landed in the nearby forest. And then there were various incidents which have been written about at length, and I was doing more research on that back in 2003, and I found this thing called the Disclosure Project, which was Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project initiative, where he'd gathered together a lot of military and civilian witnesses to UFO incidents, and they came forward to testify, or they said they would testify before a hearing, as to what they had experienced, what they knew, what knowledge they had of black programs. And in 2003, that was actually 2 years after this event had happened. The main thing that I was watching was called the Disclosure Project press conference, and that happened in Washington DC in 2001. Big event, lots of media there, quite a bit of press coverage, considering that's what it was. But when I found out about it, I found this entry on the BBC website where it said UFO spotters slam cover-up. And I hardly think that Captain Robert Salas, who was in charge of the Minuteman nuclear missile in a bunker underground in, I think, 1967 in Minot, North Dakota, I'd hardly describe this guy as a UFO spotter, nor would I describe John Callahan, the head of the FAA, Accidents and Investigations Board or Division, who recounted his knowledge of the Japan Airlines case in 1986, where a captain and the co-pilot of a Japan Airlines flight observed a large object, I think for about an hour, on their flight. I think it was in Alaska somewhere it was going to. I'd hardly call those people UFO spotters. So my point in saying all of this is that in 2003, I knew there was a UFO cover-up. I knew that this had been covered up deliberately. Whereas before I'd only suspected it, but this evidence that Greer had put together convinced me beyond any doubt that there'd been a cover-up. And so I decided to do more research. I started to give some sort of local presentations. I tried to get people interested locally, which was very, very difficult. I didn't really get anyone interested locally. I went on to Radio Derby, and I've got a recording of that on my website with another chap who ran a UFO club locally called Omar Fowler, and he and I became good friends over the following years. And so that was really what kicked me into this arena back in 2003, and led to eventually in 2005, maybe 2006 actually, I can't remember exactly when I registered the domain name, but you can look at that online with the Who Is thing, and it's checktheevidence.com is my website. So I founded that in 2006 and started to put some of this UFO stuff on there. I started to find out a lot about 9/11. That was my next kind of stopping point. And I was just I've been adding to the website ever since then, actually. So that's now 11 years. I don't have a regular schedule. I just put things there when I'm happy that I want to put them out there, and I've researched them and stuff. And that's checktheevidence.com. And I think there's about 400 articles on there now, something like that, on various topics.
So with the JFK sort of assassination, that, because I've obviously looked into that as well, and I think there's definitely suspicious shit that went on. What's your sort of brief overview, like obviously as much as you can, I know it's quite a deep situation, of sort of the events that happened then and who was involved, and maybe what your take is on what happened that day?
Well, it would appear there was a conspiracy to get Lyndon B. Johnson into power, and I think there's quite a strong set of evidence which says that he, was working things behind the scene, not he alone, but he and others. And so that was one of the main things. And I think it's probably true that they wanted to get rid of Kennedy because he threatened to break up the CIA, and he'd also threatened to kind of reduce or remove the power of the Federal Reserve. Those are two big things. Because, for example, not many people know that Kennedy had ordered the issuance of these redback dollars, and I think they were government backed, so they the government could issue these notes, and they weren't bound to charge interest. In other words, they're immune from this national debt because it was basically government credit, essentially, if I understand it correctly. Whereas the Federal Reserve is a private bank, and so Kennedy realised that the Federal Reserve was going to shaft the U.S. government and control all the finances, basically, which has gone on to this day. As to who was responsible, well, obviously there were people in the CIA that were involved. It appears that there were people in the mafia who were involved as well. There was a network there, and I think there's some evidence that Kennedy was actually shot from a storm drain. There's this account of a guy going down into a storm drain, a fairly young chap, as I recall. I can't remember his name, and that you could actually poke a gun, up through just near the sort of curbstone. There's a particular curbstone in Dealey Plaza. That's meant to have been one of the fatal shots, so there might have been as many as six people shooting at Kennedy. And and this whole story of the grassy knoll, for example, that's probably disinformation, misdirection, and the whole thing with the Zapruder film as well, which was this film of Kennedy being shot, which wasn't shown publicly until 1964. There are two versions of that film, so it's definitely been doctored, that film, and you can look at the analysis of that. There was a chap that would actually done a video analysis for the CIA who came out, I think, a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago, and he realised there were two versions of the Zapruder film. There was another team that had been working on it separate to his team, because he had to present this to the various intelligence bods at that time. I think in the mid '60s when they were doing this intelligence work. You can check out that. And an interesting film to watch is called "Everything Is a Rich Man's Trick."
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, which is about 3 hours long. Now there's some 9/11 stuff in that towards the end, which is wrong. It's disinformation, unfortunately. But I was in communication with a lady called Judith Vary Baker, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's girlfriend, and she gained a lot of inside knowledge into sort of the backstory, or part of the backstory of the Kennedy assassination. And she knew David Ferrie, and she obviously knew Lee Harvey Oswald, and she knew Jack Ruby as well, a little bit. And she's written a very interesting book called Me and Lee, and it has got a subtitle, the name of which temporarily escapes me. And I recommend people read that, which has been published by with the help of Ed Haslam. And the interesting thing that comes out in Judith Ferry Baker's book, which was why she was involved with it, is a link to cancer research, because she was involved in trying to weaponize a strain of cancer, which was part of a plot to kill Fidel Castro. And that's all described at quite a bit of length in her book, which is called Me and Lee, How I think so, How I Loved and Lost Lee Harvey Oswald, I think, something like that. And as far as I'm aware, everything that I know, Judith Ferry Baker is totally genuine. Her story checks out. Essentially was verified by Ed Haslam, who had done a lot of research into the cancer connection due to him. My pussycat here walking across the table. And he did a lot of research into the cancer connection, and he was looking for a domestic laboratory, which he'd uncovered in his research into the activities of David Ferrie. And then a few years after he'd uncovered this information, he actually found Judith Ferry Baker, who was actually one of the people that was doing these cancer research experiments in David Ferrie's apartment. So it all checked out with research that he'd done years earlier. And that Ed Haslam's book is Dr. Mary's Monkey, which covers a lot of the same ground as Judith Ferry Baker's book does, but from a different, researcher's point of view, and different sort of path that Ed Haslam followed. So yeah, I mean that, I haven't got a lot about that on my website. I haven't got a lot about the Kennedy assassination. I have got a review of Judith Ferry Baker's book, and I communicated with Judith Ferry Baker on Facebook. She'd used Facebook. She only came out of the sort of woodwork about 2002, I think it was, and they did a History Channel documentary on her story, which was then taken off their website, and the DVD which was made of that was removed from sale. It was part of the Men Who Killed Kennedy series, and her video was taken out of that series. You can still get it online if you look around, but the History Channel got a lot of heat for in particular for her episode, and make of that what you will.
Yeah, I mean, what I always find about people that are sort of anti-conspiracy is they always say, it's just coincidence, maybe someone got lucky, and then you kind of get to a point, like from, say, yourself and myself, where we look at these things and go, how many fucking coincidences can there be for one situation? Do you know what I mean? So sometimes, like, surely things have got to start being black and white here, rather than all these sort of riddles and hidden people and suspicious acts. Right. And yet, I think what happens is, and I've been putting this in the last couple of books that I've written. The key thing that needs to be done early on, when you've got anything that's got to be, like the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, Diana, when that has been done with state involvement at some level, and the state is involved with that event, and they have to cover it up, they create a consensus about what the real story is, and they do that typically within the first 24 or 48 hours of the event actually happening. You get the very first bits that come out will, make people realise you don't really know what's going on, but within 24, 48 hours, they'll establish a consensus story which they want to become reality. And that's true of most of the mainstream issues that I've found, climate change, the UFO ET issue, 9/11, Diana, Kennedy, 7/7. It's the same technique. You establish a consensus, you need a critical mass to subscribe to that consensus, which as soon as you've got it out on the TV,
you pretty much got it, because there's more people still watch TV than don't watch TV, So if you get it on the TV, you get the story reasonably coherent with a sort of coherent enough narrative. It doesn't have to be brilliant, just as long as it's good enough. That is what sticks, and that's what gets programmed into people. And then people like us, we're always fighting that for the rest of our lives. That's how it works.
Yeah, that whole yeah, man, I saw it on television, so it must be true. It's like, I fucking saw the Transformers on television. Do you know what I mean? It don't mean it's true. Like things can be faked and lied. But talk to me about because I'm also interested in sort of like the UFO side of things. What sort of evidence have you got, or like found, that supported the claim of existence of UFOs? And because I know there's like a lot of information out there. But also there's always, especially on YouTube, these like clickbaity shitty videos that you go on and you're like, for fuck's sake, why have I done this?
It is. I mean, particularly the UFO issue is like you say, you get a lot of clickbait and a lot of videos which are rather dubious, and you get a mix of good and bad. So what I came across, as I said earlier on, I can recommend the Disclosure Project videos, which are still out there. Many of those witnesses, I think, are credible. They are telling the truth. Particularly, as I say, people like Robert Salas, the missile operator who was in this capsule in 1967. You can check out his story both on the Disclosure Project, and he's given a number of interviews elsewhere. There's also Dr. Robert Jacobs, who I met last September when he came over here for a conference. He accidentally filmed a UFO firing a beam at a dummy nuclear warhead in 1967, this so-called Big Sur incident. His account is also, to me, very credible. He doesn't have the actual film, because that was taken in a military context. He was an optical instrumentation officer. His testimony is very credible. You can look into that. The whole thing with the Roswell incident, I am convinced from everything that I've read and listened to that at least one, maybe as many as 3 objects crashed in New Mexico in 1947 at the beginning of July. And material was recovered and taken eventually to Wright Field, now become Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I think the thrust of what is in the film Roswell, with Paul David's film from 1994, I think somebody stuck that on YouTube. It's fairly easy to find that online. If you watch the 1994 Roswell film, I think that's a pretty accurate account of the events that unfolded in 1947. What they did in that film, they've put a bit of dramatic, recreation in there, and I think they have this sort of mechanism of a 1970s reunion of some of the original guys from the Roswell case. I don't think that 1970s reunion ever actually happened. They used that as a plot line to bring in, the other witnesses and get them to speak to each other in the film, whereas that didn't really happen. But the rest of it, with the object crashing, Jesse Marcel recovering the debris, taking it home to show his wife and his child, Jesse Marcel Jr., him putting it under the bed, and then eventually having it give up to the military. That story, as far as I can tell, is 100% true. And bits of one of the particular areas of interest to me was this so-called memory metal, where they recovered this metal from the craft, and you could scrunch it up in your hand and then let go of it, and it would be perfect. There was no creases, nothing. You couldn't cut it with an acetylene torch, you couldn't cut it with scissors. It was completely impervious to destruction. And the interesting thing is that there are about 7 or 8 different accounts of people having bits of that metal. There's a lady called June Crane. She's passed on. She described seeing it right past, and it was brought into her office. She was a typist, and one of the officers came in and showed her this. That I think was in 47 as well. She didn't disclose her story until I think she was a couple of years before she died. And you can listen to her account. There's a recording of her that you can find online. There's another guy called Jerry Croth, who's I think he's about 70 now, 75, and he's a lecturer, I think, in psychology. And he said that in 1965 he was shown a piece of this metal. A student came into his class and said, "Oh, look what I got from my dad," and showed him a piece of this metal, and he kind of didn't really pay that much attention to it at the time. So that's a completely separate account of this memory metal. And you can listen to Jerry Cross videos. He's done some very good, very well kind of narrated videos. There's that. A lot of evidence in the Roswell case, a lot to get through. You can read some of the books. Stanton Friedman, again, has done a lot of research. He was the first civilian investigator in 1978 to uncover details of the Roswell case. So there's that. And one of the other things which I became aware of not long after I became aware of the Disclosure Project was something called the Star Child Project, which turned out to be a bit of a misnomer. The Star Child Project I've given a couple of presentations on more recently due to the death of the person that was involved in the research in 2013. And the Star Child, what's that? Well, what the Star Child is a real bone skull. And it was found in a cave in Mexico in 1930 by a teenage girl, along with some other bones. And there was a human skull and this unusual looking skull found side by side in this cave in an old mining area in, say, 1930. She gathered up the skulls. She took them home. It was in the about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua in Mexico. She was on vacation there, on holiday, as we'd say. And she took these skulls, she took them to, she sort of spirited them away, kept them hidden from her parents who didn't like the look of these. And she kept them until she died, basically. And I think it was in about 1994, sometime like that, when she was in her 70s or 80s. And she gave these skulls to another family who didn't like having skulls in the house. They gave them to another guy who also weren't that comfortable. And then they passed them on to the current owners, Ray and Melanie Young, who live in El Paso, Texas. And Melanie Young was a neonatal nurse. She knew the skull was very unusual because she'd worked with children and she had good knowledge of anatomy. And then she contacted a researcher called Lloyd Pye, who'd done a lot of research into what's known as human origins, and evolution from, or so-called evolution, or so-stated evolution from apes and monkeys and that sort of thing, which turns out to be highly questionable theory for various reasons I won't go into now. So he looks at the skull and says, "Oh yeah, this is strange. I can see that all the bones are different." And he noticed that the eye sockets were only half an inch deep. Human eye sockets are 2 inches deep. The way that the cheeks were, angled was different. And he could see that the way that this bones in the skull were arranged was different. If anybody that wants to look at this can just look at starchildproject.com and look at a video which is 17 minutes long called Star Child for Dummies that Lloyd did in 2012. That's a very good summary in 17 minutes of all the anomalies. And Lloyd took on this skull. He took it with him. He tried to get it to university professors and so forth. Eventually found a chap called Ted Robinson, who was a craniofacial plastic surgeon, I think was his correct title. But he knew about the head and the skull and the face and the bones in your face. He knew all of that because he was a plastic surgeon, basically. So he had a very detailed knowledge of where the bones should be. And the Star Child skull, it was completely, he'd never seen anything like it. It wasn't a deformity either. People have tried to say it's, if you go onto Wikipedia right now, you'll see that it's described as a deformed human skull. That is a lie. Wikipedia lies. They censor and cover up this information. And if you try and change it and put in reference to research, they will edit it, change it back, and delete it. So people probably already know that, but it's particularly galling in the case of the Star Child skull. As a result, I try never to click on any Wikipedia links now if I can possibly avoid doing so, because it needs to just go away. Wikipedia, it is the Ministry of Truth, but that's a little side rant. Star Child skull, bones all different, teeth different. The bone chemistry was checked. They dissolved some bone. It had a higher than human content of aluminium. The other elemental balances were different. So we've got physical evidence here. It's a physical, real bone skull. It's not a hoax. It's carbon dated twice, 900 years old, plus or minus 40 years. Those have been done separately. It's undergone testing for DNA. The DNA basically is highly unusual. And that's all on the Star Child Project website. It's been x-rayed. We can see from the x-ray it's not the skull of a hydrocephalic, which is the common claim that's made for it. Neither is it the skull of a progeria victim. You can see, for example, it's got lines in the x-ray which show where the veins went inside the skull. It also had what are called brain casts done. So you take the skull, you pour a material inside it, you make a cast of the skull of the outside and the inside as well. You pour a material in, you then break open the cast, and you can see what the brain looked like. With a human skull, you see, everyone knows what a brain looks like. They put it on TV all the time. You see this sort of like cauliflower type thing, that's what a human brain looks like. The Star Child skull's brain is completely smooth. It's completely smooth. And if you look at the way that the brain was, sat inside the skull, if it sat the same way in a human skull, the brain would have fallen down through the neck and the being would not have lived. But with the Star Child, it didn't. Obviously, it was a living being. It grew. Living being. It grew. So the brain that it was made of, the material, the substance, must have been different to our brain. So there's all kinds of things that have come out of that research, which has been done over a period of about 14 years. And everything that I followed from Lloyd Pye, as far as I could tell, it was totally legitimate. He would announce the research, as he was given information about it by specialists in those fields, some of which were named, some of which didn't want to be named. That's all on the starchildproject.com website. And I recommend people go and read that, because as far as I'm concerned, it is the closest thing we've got to real physical evidence of an alien being having come to the Earth at least once 900 years ago. And there's been a very troubling development in the last sort of 18 months with the owner now saying that the skull is that of a human child. I won't go into all the details. Those are all on my website. But the owner in the last 18 months has now said that the skull is of a human child. 14 years, 15 years, 16 years after actually saying there was no way it was a human child and giving that skull to another researcher. This is a very, very peculiar development, which would probably take too long to go into right now. But I've written that up at length. Well, I don't know what's going on with it, basically, but I've given a few ideas as to what might be going on. But that, to me, is pretty much slam dunk evidence that this was an alien which came to the Earth and died on Earth in the sort of 13th, 14th century, that sort of time frame. So people can go and check that story out. It's very worthwhile of your time.
No, I mean, fucking sounds really interesting. I'll definitely be going and checking that out. Sounds like the guy who has suddenly changed his story has been hushed up, Well, something very strange. Melanie Young, the owner, that's changed her story, and it was Lloyd Pye that did all the research. He has his own website, lloydpye.com, and he died of cancer. He was a very good friend of mine, actually. It was a huge loss when he died. And that was in December 2013. So
people have said that he was bumped off, he was done in. He didn't think he was, and he wrote about that before he died. But the fact is, he's no longer with us, so he can't continue the research. And all this debunking attempt that I'm sort of alluded to, that came out obviously after he died, which is, well, again, make of that what you will.
No one to back the story. So moving on to sort of 9/11 now. When did you sort of realise there was something fishy about the events that unfolded on that day?
So 9/11, I started following threads from the Disclosure Project, and I came across something about state-sponsored terrorism, and I'd never heard this expression. And as I've told the story many times, I came across this film called 9/11: The Great Illusion, which was by George Humphrey, and I think that's still knocking about online somewhere. And that showed how the towers were actually destroyed at a rate of free fall, essentially. In other words, as Eric Hufschmid later said in a later video I watched, the buildings, although they didn't actually fall, he described them, they fell through themselves faster than they could fall through the air. I mean, it's just totally ridiculous. And there was a little calculation in this film by George Humphrey, which was shown, and I thought, oh well, that's something I can check that, because that's due to the equations of motion that they calculated this. For those that know these, S equals ut plus a half at squared, or actually ut is 0 because the initial velocity is 0, so it becomes S equals a half at squared. So you can calculate the free fall time of an object. In other words, if you were to take the height of the towers, which was 1,368 feet, roughly 400 meters, and you were to drop, a marble ball bearing or whatever off the top, then approximately 9.2 seconds later, that ball bearing should hit the ground, which was exactly the time. If you go and watch the videos and look at how long it took the towers to disappear, it's about between 8 and 10 seconds. And that's when I really thought, no, that is, there's no way. There's no way. And I remember hearing sometime before that, about Michael Meacher, who questioned the official story of the hijackers and how Mohammed Atta was given money by somebody or other in the US government to go and do something. And he actually questioned that publicly, and it was lambasted for that. I later met Michael Meacher, who was a cabinet minister at that time. He was lambasted by the US State Department, and just not really. The BBC didn't really present his account very well at all, as far as I remember. But anyway, so that's when in 2000, I think it's probably late 2003, maybe early 2004, I think it was in this George Humphreys film that they put forward this notion that the towers were destroyed with explosives with bombs. And I thought, yeah, it must have been something to do with that. And I sort of went forward from there, looking at these accounts of the Pentagon, for example, where this alleged plane crash had taken place, yet there were very little sign of a plane crash actually in the pictures and the images that came back initially. And indeed, there is a famous clip by Jamie McIntyre, who was a CNN reporter, and he's there at the Pentagon, and the guy in the studio says, "Oh, I understand there's a plane has crashed there." And Jamie McIntyre actually says, on the live broadcast, well, I can't see any evidence of a plane crash here. There's no large pieces. He actually says that. And then he later had to, of course, give the quote-unquote correct story, and he reneged on his own report, But that's the Pentagon thing. So I think I was first looking at the Pentagon after I think I looked at the World Trade Center, and I remember making some leaflets about that and giving them out to people and stuff at the time. And it was really, the next thing was that I was looking more into this idea of the explosives in the towers, and I came across this physicist from Brigham Young University called Stephen E. Jones, and he was talking about this material called thermite having been used, which isn't actually an explosive, it's an incendiary, and they use it to actually weld steel. And he was putting out this story that thermite had been used to cut through the steel girders and make the towers fall down. And I kind of bought into this at that time because I thought, he's a physicist. He's from Brigham Young. I checked him out. He was on their website. He had his own university webpage and stuff. And then I think it was a couple of months after I first heard him speak, he said that he was forming this group called Scholars for 9/11 Truth. And I thought, oh, that sounds like a good idea. And they had somebody had set up a website, and they were saying, if you work for a university, then you can join our website and add your voice to the dissenting voices, which is going to talk to the US government and get them to reopen the investigation and all this stuff. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. And then I actually had been posting stuff on a forum. I posted this thing about the free fall on a physics forum sometime in 2005, I think, probably mid 2005. And I posted this equation of motion thing. I think you can still find this thread somewhere. I haven't looked for years because that was back in 2005. And then this Stephen E. Jones guy, he actually contacted me and invited me to join this scholars group. I still work for the Open University in the UK. I was working for them then back in 2005, and I work for them now as a tutor. I'm part-time, and I'm not. I don't do any academic research into 9/11 or anything like that. I'm just a tutor on IT modules. I don't really talk about this hardly ever, if at all, actually, in Open University circles. People, I mentioned it a couple of times, but it never really goes anywhere. No. Basically. So Jones and this other guy called Fetzer, Jim Fetzer, who is very prolific on the internet even now, with various websites and podcasts that he does. I'll maybe talk a bit more about him in a bit, but they formed the Scholars for 9/11 Truth group, which was basically just a website, and they said, did I want to join? They sent me an email and I said, yeah, of course. And they set up a forum, and they started posting stuff on the forum, and and it was Jones had written this paper about thermite, and he posted that, and everyone reviewed it, and I reviewed it, and I spotted a spelling mistake or something, and fed back on that. But I thought this guy was the real deal, and he was trying to find the truth about what happened on 9/11. Same with Fetzer. But in the course of sort of exchanges with email and forum exchanges and whatnot, I began to see that there was another story here as well, that there was something else going on here. And I became familiar over a period of time, over a few months, with the research of another of the Scholars for 9/11 Truth, Dr. Judy Wood. And she was heavily attacked, not, on the mainstream, but on the actual forum. The Scholars for 9/11 Truth was attacking Dr. Judy Wood's research, or just either attacking it or ignoring it. And I started to look at this, and she was actually talking about the destruction of the towers and how they'd been destroyed. And that's what had initially interested me in this George Humphrey film. And she'd done a rather more elegant sort of analysis than this little equation of motion thing that I'd done. And Dr. Judy Wood was a professor of essentially mechanical engineering. She'd actually done the branch off of that. She'd had specialist expertise in interferometry and engineering mechanics and materials engineering science. Those were her areas of specialism. So she was used to looking at how materials behaved when under stress, how they disintegrate, when bridges fall down, and civil engineering accidents happen. She was an expert in those sorts of areas. Stress analysis was another area of her expertise. And I found out about this, and I found this billiard ball example that she'd done, which wasn't a model or anything like that. It was just like, let's have a look at what would happen if you had this little model with these billiard balls, and each one would drop down 10 meters and then trigger off another billiard ball, and then that would drop 10 meters, trigger off another. And she compared this to how the towers disappeared. And she did this because to actually consider the problem of the destruction of the towers head on, it's upsetting for people, because they're thinking of 9/11. So she came up with another example as a way, of neutralizing that emotional reaction and comparing it to just a set of billiard balls falling, and then comparing that to 9/11, and that was illustrative of that there was a problem with the official story. That, I think, was her main objective at that time. And people were really knocking this example. And Jones wouldn't talk about the destruction of the towers in terms of how rapidly it occurred. He wanted to get everyone to talk about this thermite stuff, and I bought into that at first. But the big thing which came out the following year, or what I found out from somebody else, it was somebody else that told me, is that Stephen E. Jones had a research history, and his research history was involved with another thing that I was interested in, and it was another of the things that I searched for the first time I got internet access back in 1997, and it was cold fusion, which is an energy phenomenon, and an unusual energy phenomenon. And Jones had done research into cold fusion in 1985, and later still I found out that it was Stephen E. Jones and another chap he knew called Paul Palmer. They actually coined the term cold fusion. They coined this, and there were two chemists to explain what cold fusion is. It's an unusual energy effect in a phrase, but it's what it is. And you can go and read about the furore over this. There's books have been written about it, particularly Eugene Malov's book. It was an electrolysis experiment. What's electrolysis? Electrolysis means breakdown by electricity. Anyone can get a battery. They can get some salt, dissolve that in a glass of water, get two wires going from your battery, attach them to two bits of metal like two razor blades or two pins or anything that's metal, two bits of tin foil, put the two electrodes as they'll be into your glass of water with salt in it, and you get bubbles coming off. That you'll get hydrogen and chlorine coming out of that. And that's electrolysis. Pons and Fleischmann did a different electrolysis experiment in the 1980s, and they were using deuterated water, which is water that's got an extra neutron in the molecule. It's called deuterium, D2O. And they were using a solution of deuterated water and lithium hydroxide, for those that know a bit of chemistry. I know a bit of chemistry, not in a massive amount, but I do know a bit. And they found that under certain conditions, they would get more energy out of their electrolysis cell than they would get in. And it was poorly understood. At times it was difficult to reproduce. And they came out with this research in slightly unusual circumstances in 1989. Stephen E. Jones was heavily involved with that in 1989. And Pons and Fleischmann were targeted with debunking, with character assassination, and all of this. And that was all written up very, very well by another scientist, Dr. Eugene Malov, in a book called Fire from Ice, and you can get that on Amazon. I think it might even be a Kindle version now. And so Jones had this history with energy phenomenon research, and he was involved in trying to get the research of Pons and Fleischmann into whether you could get more energy out of an experiment than you put into it. In other words, free energy, energy from nowhere, or apparently from nowhere, but obviously from somewhere. He was involved in debunking that. I found that out in 2007, and I thought that's peculiar. But then I became more familiar with Dr. Judy Wood's research, which had been ongoing since 9/11. Actually, she'd been researching this for, by that point, 6 years. And she'd started posting stuff on the internet in 2004 to share with a colleague who she was discussing these findings with. And she'd noticed, for example, that there were circular holes in the tops of some of the buildings in World Trade Center 5 and 6. Most of the center of World Trade Center building number 6 was completely missing. If you looked from the satellite view, she pointed out that the buildings actually didn't burn up. They didn't slam to the ground. They turned mostly to dust in midair. And that's actually, as I was to learn between 2007 and 2008, that's what happened. The buildings turned to dust before they hit the ground. The videos prove that. She also had seismic recordings from Palisades seismic station and one in New Jersey. They had registered earthquakes and quarry blasts in the region around the time of 9/11. But they'd also registered that the World Trade Center towers, there was no There was no, I might get the things mixed up, there was no P wave or there was no S wave. One of the seismic waves, I can't remember which one without checking, was missing, which meant that the buildings had actually, they hadn't hit the ground. They'd essentially, the material that the buildings were made up of had disappeared. It had turned to dust. So the seismic readings said it, the videos say it, the aftermath says it. If you look at, for example, the picture taken about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, showing the field around where towers 1 and 2 sat, there is no debris. There is almost none in relation to the size of the buildings. The buildings had completely disappeared by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, not completely, obviously there was some debris, I'm exaggerating slightly. But you go and look at the images again, and then people tried to say, oh, well, it obviously all went into the sub-basements, because there were 9 stories below ground. How can you fit 110 stories of building, compress it down into 9 stories underground? How could 14 people survive in Stairwell B? There's a whole Channel 4 documentary made about these guys called The Miracle of Stairwell B. That was made, I think, in 2006, 2007. Go and watch it. These firefighters walked out. They had 100 stories of building above them. They looked up and Mickey Cross saw blue sky. How can that happen? It could only happen if the buildings disappeared above them and turned to dust, which is what happened. So in other words, without going into all the lengths of it at this point, I realised that Stephen E. Jones was deliberately managing people like me. He was managing their perception. This was another false 9/11 story that Jones knew was false, and he was deliberately putting it out, to mislead people. It wasn't that he just didn't understand the physics or, he or anything like that. He was just being a bit dumb. He was deliberately misleading people because the real story was of vast importance, such vast importance that they had to character assassinate Dr. Judy Wood, and that's what Jones and Fetzer became part of. And I realised in 2007 that they were out to get her, and I basically ended up writing a whole book. It's called 9/11 Finding the Truth, which is available free download from my website. I wrote a whole book about the effort that was being a coordinated effort, which was, significant, very significant, to discredit Dr. Judy Wood and her research. And Fetzer, for example, just to give you a little bit more about him, and he's still very active. He's still posting stuff online. He describes me as being part of a Judy Wood cult, and people that support the research, which if you support certain things being true, as in physical evidence being correct, that's not part of a cult. That's part of scientific verification and observation. If I say to you that the towers turn mostly to dust in midair, that's not me being part of a cult. That's something you can go and observe for yourself in the videos. But according to Jim Fetzer, when I say things like that, I'm part of a Judy Wood cult, because that's what Judy Wood first observed and demonstrate those observations to everyone else. So Fetzer, just to give you a little example, I've written at length about his antics. And my goal is not to be nasty to anyone. All I've done is document their behaviour. I don't really care what they say to me. They can call me whatever they like. It's water off a duck's back. I'm the youngest of 9 children. I was called all kinds of stuff. I was criticised at school. People call me all kinds of names at school. I don't care. It doesn't bother me. But Fetzer, for example, what he did, he invited me along with Jones into the Scholars Group. That was the first thing that happened at the end of 2005. Throughout 2006, I was posting on the forum and stuff, and got to know a few of the people through that, as much as one can through forum postings. And just one sec. You might have heard the microwave oven going in the background there. Hopefully you can hear it. So Fetzer, he invited me then onto the steering committee for the Scholars Group because he was impressed with my truth-seeking, conviction or something. I can't remember the exact words he used, but I've put that in my book. So if he invites me onto the steering committee as some kind of, commentator, or whatever you want to call it, surely he values my judgment. And in fact, that's essentially what he said in this email to me. So when we get further along in the research with Dr. Judy Wood, who wasn't invited onto the steering committee, I don't think. And we realised that the energy effects that Dr. Wood had been documenting for probably 2 or 3 years, like I say, these holes in the building, that wasn't the result of thermite. It wasn't the result of bombs. The buildings turning to dust wasn't the result of explosive kinetic energy like bombs or anything like that. It was something completely different. It was a different type of process. The destructive mechanism didn't involve bombs. It didn't involve nuclear explosions. It didn't involve thermite. It didn't involve any of that stuff. Something else was involved. And in late 2007, Dr. Wood had revisited something she'd stumbled across earlier on, and I'd already been familiar with, but I hadn't made the connection to something called the Hutchison effect. What's the Hutchison effect? It's an energy effect. It's an energy effect that was discovered in the 1980s by Canadian researcher John Hutchison. And he was doing experiments with microwave generators, signal generators, electrostatic fields, a radioactive source, Tesla coils, and mixing together these different types of energy, he was able to get materials to turn to jelly, to levitate, to apparently burst into flames, but the flames or the fires, these weird fires, weren't hot. They were cool. They were cool fires. And as Dr. Wood had been through 40,000 pictures of 9/11 evidence, she'd seen evidence the same as what was in John Hutchison's experiment. Like you've got apparently glowing red-hot metal in a picture in a photograph from the World Trade Center area next to paper. How can that be? If the metal is red-hot glowing, right, 6 inches away from a piece of paper, the paper would be charred. It would be burning. She'd seen this on multiple pictures, so she realised. And then what else have we got? We've got witnesses like Mickey Cross coming down the stairs in the World Trade Center, reports that his helmet is lifting off. He's lifting off as he's coming down the stairs, and he has to pull it back onto his head. How does that happen? How does that happen? And then we've got David Hansher, a photographer for the New York Daily News. He's near the towers while they're being destroyed. He's lifted up and carried a block. He's levitated and carried a block. Another witness, the name of whom escapes me, they're near the towers as the building is being destroyed. I'm not saying coming down because it didn't come down. It was destroyed. It turned to dust. He dove under an ambulance. And waited for, to die, basically, because this building was coming down right on top of him. The building has disappeared. He gets up. He dove under an ESU truck, like an ambulance. Truck's not there. When he gets up, the truck's gone. So thought the truck had been blown off. If the truck's been blown off, why didn't he feel the wind? So all of these effects stacked up, and I was in discussion with Dr. Wood when she'd sort of put all this together, and I'd set up a website for her in 2007, just because I was, conversant with such things. And so she posted this. She'd collected all the images together. We'd talked about the Hutchison effect. We got some images from John. We'd been in communication with John Hutchison in Canada at the time, and we posted this on the website. And so we spoke to Fetzer, who was still sort of following our research then, and Dr. Wood said, Jim, I've got some new images to show you and some new pages on my website I've just posted. And he said, right, well, I'll just go down to my computer then. Went down to his basement, got himself a cup of coffee. He called back a few minutes later when he was ready. She sends him the link to the new page that we'd uploaded. I was aware that this had happened. And Fetzer looks at it. What's the first thing he says? I've just got to make a phone call, he says, and stop the conversation. And after that point, basically, and this is all written up in my book at quite some length, if anybody wants to read it, he then started to try and character assassinate Dr. Judy Wood and character assassinate John Hutchison, who we stayed in fairly regular communication with at that time. And I'm still in occasional communication with John. So we knew from the evidence that this was an important connection. And it's a connection which even now, 11 years after essentially Dr. Wood discovered this, is rarely talked about. Many of your listeners, I'm sure, your viewers will be familiar with the alternative theories, if you want to call them that, about 9/11. Very few will have heard of this Hutchison effect connection. And I, as I said, to take a few steps back in the story, I had been invited onto this. I was on the steering committee for this 9/11 Scholars, not for 9/11 Truth group, organised by Fetzer. And I said to Jim Fetzer, look, you need to investigate the Hutchinson effect. I'd already heard of the Hutchinson effect. I heard about it in 1999 because it was covered in a book by Albert Budden that I'd read that a friend had given me then. So I already knew about this. I knew it was worth checking out. And I'd heard about it in a documentary by Nick Cook, which was called $1 Billion Secret, which talks about the US black programs, the unacknowledged special access programs, and so forth. And that was in 1999. So I said to Fetzer, you should look into this, Jim. This is really important. And he basically blew me off, and then he basically said that at the end of it, I was childish and I didn't have a sufficient intellect to be to match up to his, and things like that. Which, like I say, it's water off a duck's back. Whatever my level of intellect may or may not be, or whatever my attitude towards Dr. Judy Wood is, does not change the facts that the towers turned to dust. David Hanshaw was levitated, as he says in his account, and John Hutchinson has, created levitation effects in his experiments. Whatever anyone says about me or Dr. Judy Wood, or whether we're part of a cult, those things will not change, obviously. So we knew that this was true, and Dr. Judy Wood, with the help of attorney Jerry Leapart, later. On in 2007, she actually started a court case based on this evidence. Again, very few people are familiar with this because it was covered up, and it was covered up by the 9/11 Truth Movement, funnily enough. And again, I've written that up at length in my books. So to explain a little bit about that, so we got all this evidence, towers turned to dust, buildings disappeared, thousands of pictures, witness testimony, levitation, all that stuff. So Dr. Wood had been looking at the technical reports which were produced by the US government to explain and describe the destruction of the World Trade Center. Now, there's another little coincidence here. We talked about coincidences earlier on. Here's another one. In 2005, the US government department known as NIST, or body, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, they released 10,000 pages of technical reports about the destruction of the World Trade Center. And these reports were meant to sort of analyse in detail what happened to the towers, why these alleged plane crashes caused the towers to, come down, in their words, to collapse. I've managed to avoid using that word until now because the towers did not collapse. And they produced these reports, which was called the Collapse of the World Trade Center Towers, the final report or something. Now, this report was created because of a mandate from Congress, and Congress mandated NIST, who were given a budget of $16 million in around about 2003 to investigate this destruction. But what NIST did is they didn't produce the report themselves exactly. They actually used 23 contractors, 23 private companies to produce these reports. Two of those companies are of particular interest, which most listeners probably will never have heard of because, as I say, most of this has been covered up by the 9/11 Truth Movement, as I've been saying for 8 or 9 or 10 years now. Science Applications International Corporation, that's one company, now branched off partly into another company called Leidos, Leidos, and Applied Research Associates. Now, Science Applications International Corporation, they apparently had like a coordinating role in bringing these reports together to make the final sort of package, and you can read about their contracts somewhere on the NIST website. If anybody wants any of these links to this information and can't find it themselves, please write to me at checktheevidence.com. I've got a contact button on there. You can easily write to me and just ask me any questions that come up following anything I discuss here. I'll try and send you the links and whatnot. Yeah. So Science Applications International Corporation, they coordinated some aspects of the reproduction of these reports. And then there was another company called Applied Research Associates who produced reports about the alleged plane crashes and how these planes sort of crashed into the buildings and they produced some of these computer animations and simulated how the damage occurred and stuff. And there was another company called Underwriters Laboratories, and what they did was they built a section of a floor of the World Trade Center in their warehouse, and they built it to the same specification with the same materials, the same fireproofing, the same dimensions. I think it was a third of a floor or something. You can find it in their report if you really want to. And then they set this on fire, and they burned it for they burned this model they built twice as hot, twice as long, and the metal was still there. It didn't turn to dust, it didn't fall down. It was perfectly fine after the fire, obviously, apart from the actual, char marks and things. Yet they signed off on that report that fire had destroyed the towers. That is science fraud. That's science fraud. So what they committed was, in other words, to say what this case was based on. Just one second. So what that was based on was that the court case was based on this idea of the Data Quality Act. The Data Quality Act in the US says that if you're a company, you produce reports, you have to produce an accurate report. And if you've been paid money and your report is inaccurate, a person that spots the inaccuracy can request correction of your report, and if you refuse to correct it, you can sue that company that's produced that report under what's called the Data Quality Act. So Dr. Wood had identified, as I've already said, that the towers didn't collapse. They turned to dust before they hit the ground. So that report was wrong. That was an error in the report. And she submitted a 50-page document called the Request for Correction. She submitted that in April 2007, and she said to NIST, you must correct your report because it's wrong, and if you don't, I'm going to sue you under the Data Quality Act, or I'm going to sue the companies that produced these reports for you. Yeah. And with the help of Jerry Leapart, that's what she did. And the point about why I'm going to all this quite lengthy explanation is, and there's a lot more besides, is those two of those three companies that I named, Science Applications International Corporation and Applied Research Associates, are both military industrial contractors for the US military. And both of those companies do research, or have done research, into directed energy weapons systems. So what we're talking about here is that the World Trade Center wasn't destroyed by terrorists and hijackers. Neither was it destroyed by thermite, nor was it destroyed by bombs or nukes or any conventional type of explosive device or anything like that. It was actually destroyed by some type of directed energy weapon. That is the truth. It's not a theory. That's what all the evidence shows, both the evidence from the site, the evidence of the aftermath, the evidence of the people involved with the technical reports, the evidence of witnesses. All of it, every bit of it, shows that the World Trade Center was destroyed using an energy weapon. No, it wasn't a mixture of things. It wasn't a bit of this and a bit of that. That's what destroyed the World Trade Center, a directed energy weapon of some type. And they need to keep that covered up, because the technology that has been used to destroy the World Trade Center could be used in another sort of mode of operation to produce all the Earth's energy that we need for everything. No fossil fuels, no nuclear power stations, nothing. This technology, if used properly, could produce all the energy that we need. It could give us space travel. All of that comes out of this research if you explore and take it to its logical conclusion, which is what I spent a lot of time doing. So that, in other words, Stephen E. Jones was put in, and he came onto the scene in September 2005. That's when he came onto the 9/11 research scene. I'd been involved for about a year before that, before I heard of Jones. So when the NIST technical reports came out, I think, and this bit is a theory, this is my theory on this particular bit, that Jones was given a brief to say you have to steer anybody away that starts talking about energy effects or cold fusion related things, because that's what we found out later. The cold fusion has certain unusual phenomena associated with it, like low levels of nuclear radiation. With cold fusion, you do get low levels of nuclear radiation, much lower than you'd get with conventional nuclear reactors such as you have at Sellafield and 3 Mile Island and all of those. And guess what? Radioactivity was discovered following the destruction of the World Trade Center. It was a form of hydrogen called tritium that was discovered in the World Trade Center site in bottom of World Trade Center 6 in the water there, about 50 times the normal background level. And that is consistent with the sorts of things that were found in cold fusion experiments by people like John Bockris, who was a chemist from Texas A&M University. So that's all on record and had been on record since the 1990s. So that, again, shows you that they had to keep this covered up. The other thing that is an enormous part of the cover-up has been the weather. Nobody talks about the weather on 9/11 except to say that it was a beautiful sunny day when it happened. That's pretty much all you'll get in talk about the weather. Very few people will talk about what was 500 miles off the coast of New York City. Are you familiar with this at all?
Yeah. It was the hurricane or the tornado.
Hurricane Erin,
yeah. And then it just turned around and went somewhere else, or it just disappeared. I can't really remember the story.
I'll tell you the story. Yeah. So when did you become familiar with that? When did you hear about it, roughly?
Because I watched Dr. Judy Wood's "Where Did the Towers Go" presentation, so I'm obviously familiar with like the dustification and the cars that are like burnt on one end and not even marked on the other end. So yeah, I'm fairly familiar with it. Obviously, I haven't watched it for a while, so it's refreshing.
So that's like a couple of years ago you watched it, or was it like recently? Or?
No, yeah, about a couple of years ago. It'd be
a couple of years, yeah. Okay, so right, so you take that a couple of years ago. So we're talking then 2015 or 2016, something like that. So we actually started talking about Hurricane Erin. It was Dr. Judy Wood essentially discovered that in February 2008 when she discovered it. And she started compiling information about it. And April 2008 is when we put it on the website. So you probably found out about it then roughly 8 years after we had started putting that information out. Why I'm going to that, being pedantic about that, it's to try and illustrate to people how the cover-up works. You as a person who's interested in the alternative knowledge research and call it conspiracy theories. I hate that term because it was invented by the CIA. But you as somebody who's interested in that, you didn't become aware of it until 8 years after that information was available. And there may be many of your listeners that are hearing this information for the first time. So yes, you're right about the hurricane. It was 500 miles off the coast of New York City. It was, I've told this account many times, it's in the Hurricane Data Center. If you go and look at that, you can find Hurricane Erin, named on the 1st of September 2001, travelled across the Atlantic, hit Bermuda on the 7th of September, did a bit of damage. CNN reported that story, did a bit of damage on Bermuda, and they said, don't worry about it, it's going out to sea, nothing to worry about. Pretty much travelled in a straight line for 4 days, made a beeline for New York City. And bearing in mind the fuss that's been made about other hurricanes that have since followed similar paths towards New York City, I think we had one last year or the year before. There was Hurricane Bill and Hurricane Sandy, and I think there was another one last year, the name of which escapes me. Hardly anyone talked about Erin. In fact, you can see the news broadcasts from the morning of 9/11. Two of them don't even mention it. Two of them don't even mention this hurricane, and yet it's literally the outer bands are on Cape Cod. If you go and look at the map, you'll see that Cape Cod is fairly close to New York. It's a couple of 100 miles down the coast, but it's by line of sight. It's not that far away. And as you said, this hurricane went right up, and it stopped. 8 o'clock in the morning on 9/11, it was closest to New York City. It was at its widest expanse. It was traveling at its slowest speed. And then on the 12th of September, it made a 130-degree turn, headed out towards Newfoundland. So how does that happen? How does that happen? How does that happen? How is it that we have a weather event that's coincident with the events of 9/11? Is that a coincidence, everyone? Is this really a coincidence?
It's, there's a lot of strange sort of going ons and phenomenons. I mean, I remember seeing the footage in Dr. Judy Wood's presentation where it was almost like a dome shape, and there's a woman in her apartment, and she's like recording out the window, and you can see the dust coming along, hits a point and goes up, and there's like green grass, perfect on the other side, and then just it's almost like there was like an invisible wall. That's like the best way to explain it. And obviously this is footage of someone's phone from the hotel room who's recorded it. So little things like that, I think to myself, what, like, it's not natural to see, do you know what I mean? Like, obviously, so for an everyday person to try and comprehend these things, they just think, oh, that's a bit weird, but whatever, you know. Whereas when you look at it from maybe a scientific standpoint, you're like, well, this shouldn't be happening, so what's going on?
Exactly. That particular footage was by Bob and Bree, and there's some interesting things about that footage, which I won't discuss now. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And that footage there, that's one of the key pieces of evidence, that you see this dust roll out, and then for some reason it stops at a certain point and goes up. So that, as you say, if you observe that scientifically, there is information there. And what it appears, for example, to explain that is that the dust was actually continuing to disintegrate. In other words, the towers turned to dust, but that dust itself was becoming finer and finer in particulate nature, such it became lighter than air and started to actually ascend into the upper atmosphere. And that's how Dr. Wood actually found Hurricane Erin, because she was looking where this dust went, and she looked for satellite pictures, and on one of these she found Hurricane Erin, and that's when she found that trail. But this, of course, then opens up this idea that somebody can move storm systems around, because really, is it really possible to plan 9/11 and destroy the towers with a weapon just at the same time as a hurricane is actually hovering off the coast? Or is the technology also available to steer and move that hurricane so that it's put there? I think it's the latter. I think that hurricane was put there. Whether it was deliberately created or not, I don't know. You know, they may have just been created with normal processes that create hurricanes, and it was just kind of amplified or reduced or attenuated or whatever, you know, throughout its life to make it so that they could use it for 9/11. But people might be asking, and I always get asked this question, so, oh yeah, so let's just go with your theory. It's not really a theory, it's an observation. That the hurricane was part of the events of 9/11. What was it there for? Did it provide a power source for this, you know, magical directed energy weapon, as James Corbett, this legendary researcher, describes it? James Corbett, who won't talk about any of this, yet will talk about and ridicules the research of a scientist who's far more qualified than he is. James Corbett ridiculing a scientist who tells him and explains to him what 9/11 is all about. You can watch a thing I posted about him if you want, or read a thing I posted about him in the past. So, what is it? Is it really possible then that this technology exists? Well, yes, it is, because if you look at the evidence, it's highly suggestive that that's what happened. That this hurricane was put there for a reason, and that reason was to provide an electrostatic field. In other words, a field of electricity which somehow was utilised. We don't really know how, but it formed part of the process that destroyed the World Trade Center. Now, funnily enough, why I say that is, again, we go back to the experiments of John Hutchison, who uses an electrostatic field for part of his experimental research. And his electrostatic field was provided either by a Van de Graaff generator, which people might have seen in a physics class in school, which is where you get this rubber band thing, giant rubber band on a thing that spins round. It charges up this silver dome with electricity. That's a Van de Graaff generator. Or a Tesla coil, which is a more sophisticated version of the same thing, really. That's what John Hutchison was using. He was using electrostatic fields to help create these effects of levitation metals turning to jelly and so forth. So we argued, Dr. Wood argued primarily, that they were using the hurricane, because everyone knows that a thunderstorm has electricity associated with it, obviously flashes of lightning and so forth. But you can feel dry thunder was actually reported at all three of the New York airports, JFK, LaGuardia and Newark, on 9/11. So the influence of that storm system it did reach as far as New York City, because the dry thunder reports proved that. Dry thunder means they heard thunder, but there was no obvious sort of downpour of rain. So we would argue that that's what the hurricane was there for, that it was used as a component or as some kind of catalyst to make this weapon system work in the way that it did. We can't really say much more than that, because we don't know anybody in the military. We don't have any military sources that have confirmed this. Other people like John Lear have claimed that they've had corroboration of certain aspects of this, but they've certainly not contacted us directly. There's nothing really that have come to us that from deep throat sources, or whatever you want to call them, that have confirmed this. But we know that evidence is there. So in essence, we don't need those sources to confirm this, because the evidence that's available in the public record, NOAA's website, NIST, videos, witness testimony, it all tells the same story basically. So we don't really need any sort of military confirmation of that it's real, because we know that it's real.
I mean, the video footage is also suspect for myself, because like you said, it was meant to be a clear day. Sunny skies or whatever, blue skies, and yet when you see some of the footage from the news reporting stations and that, the backdrops all different colours, and I'm just
I think there's a mixture of reasons of that. Yeah, I mean that's another thing which we haven't talked about much yet, but the whole what happened with the plane scenario, because that is what impinges, I think, on what you were mentioning there about the backdrop. As you say, it's true that if you go into the Internet Archive and look at the video record from 9/11, I think they've got 11th and 12th of September, the whole day's news in the archive there, I think. You can see, yes, the sky does look different colours, and I think there's different reasons for that. Some of it is just to do with the type of camera they were using, some of it's to do with the type of tape they were recording it on, and things like that. People have tried to say that video fakery was used, and that, for example, the plane crashes, which we haven't talked about, weren't real, and I agree with that. I don't think the plane crashes were real, but the way that people like Simon Shack, Ace Baker, and a few other people have explained it is that they said that there were no planes in the sky at all, and the impression of planes was created in news broadcasts by CGI, computer generated imagery. So they'd had a 3D model running in a computer, and then they'd had that fed into the news footage somehow, a method by which they haven't explained, and that had produced these apparent planes on the news footage, and therefore it was video fakery. And I investigated that as well, and I bought into that as well, much as I bought into the thermite thing around about the same time, 2007, 2008. And I did begin to wonder about this idea of what happened with these planes. And there was quite a lot of investigation going on there, particularly with this film called September Clues by Simon Shack, which I was quite drawn into watching, and eventually I realised that much of what is in that September Clues is itself disinformation, and that's because there's a big problem with the video fakery arguments, and that is that some witnesses reported seeing the planes, and that cannot be explained easily by the CGI arguments. The way that the CGI proponents explain it is that they say the witnesses are actors, employed by the US government or the CIA, whoever, to put out a fake story that they saw planes when actually they didn't. But there are actually quite a lot of these people, and I've spoken in person to a couple of these people, and they did actually see planes. I mean, and I've spoken to a couple of people that didn't see planes when they should have seen them. and I did this article in 2007, 11 years ago almost now, called Going in Search of Planes in New York City. And I identified from 500 witness accounts. We were using this in the court case, by the way, in 2007. That was why I did this research then. There was another court case settled by Dr. Morgan Reynolds about the plane crashes. And I looked at all these witness accounts, and I identified, I think, 117 people that were at or near the World Trade Center during the time of the destruction. But only about 20% of these witnesses, of the 117, actually saw the plane, and only about 20% heard the plane, and only 8% saw and heard the plane out of those 117. Other people have tried to misquote these results, saying that only 20 people saw it, only 20% of people who were there saw it. No, only 20% of these 117 people I identified from their witness accounts on the New York Times website as being there. There were obviously thousands of people around the whole area. So we, were they all actors, these people that saw the plane? Were they really? If you have to read their accounts, I don't think these people are actors.
No.
I think what we're looking at is something much more complicated. And again, we're looking at the use of technology. And particularly this, to me, became much more powerfully apparent in 2012 when Richard D. Hall had published a 6 or 7 months analysis that he'd done, where he'd taken 26, I think it was, of the amateur videos of the plane crash, which was Flight 175, in other words, the second alleged plane crash. And he'd mapped those onto a 3D model that he made in Google SketchUp. And he overlaid the 3D model's appearance with the trajectory, which came from the radar data that NIST had published. NIST had published radar data which showed the actual path of Flight 175, and some people have said that the video faker was proved because in one video the plane comes in with a dive, in another video it comes straight on, one it comes at one angle, another angle, and so said, that's clearly bogus, that must be video fakery because the plane's coming at different angles. But if you look at Richard D. Hall's analysis, you will see it was a line of sight effect. When he wraps these videos onto the 3D model, they all marry up perfectly. In other words, this plane followed the radar path precisely, or pretty much as within a margin of error as you could establish within the data that Richard had put into this 3D model. It all followed it. So to me, that disproved the video fakery argument. And I saw that there was an effort by people like Simon Shack to promote the video fakery as the only explanation, because Shack particularly said Dr. Judy Wood cannot make reliable conclusions about the destruction of the towers because she relies on video evidence. And the video evidence is fake. It's all fake, according to Simon Shack. Therefore, we don't know how the towers were destroyed. That statement by Simon Shack is a lie. It's a bald-faced lie because, as I've already said, Dr. Judy Wood did not just use video evidence. She used seismic evidence. She used witness testimony. She visited the site. She looked at the aftermath. So does that mean that all the videos of the aftermath and all the photos of the aftermath are also faked? Because all of that evidence, proves what Judy Wood says is correct. And it's not a theory. That's the proof. It's there in the events themselves. It's there in the aftermath. So in other words, Simon Shack was deliberately promoting a false explanation, and he wouldn't see it any other way. When I pointed these things out to him, he said he wanted to believe that the towers were destroyed using conventional controlled demolition. In other words, place charges, set up in a time sequence. He wouldn't have it any other way. And more about this has come out since 2012, actually, that Mark Conlon has written up in quite considerable detail. So in other words, what I think is, to sort of summarise that, the thermite evidence and story was put together and promoted by Stephen E. Jones to cover up the fact that advanced covert technology was used to destroy the towers. Some fancy weapon system that the US military-industrial complex or the global military-industrial complex or somebody, we don't know who, has they do have it. That's not a theory. It is real. It does exist. We don't know who owns it. We don't know exactly how it works, though we know the sorts of effects it creates. We don't know how it's powered exactly. We don't know who developed it. We don't know who sanctioned its use. We don't know any of that. We just know that it's real. We know that it operates on the principle of field interference. So the thermite stuff was designed to try and cover that up, to try and stop people knowing that, and it's been very successful. You still hear people talking about thermite. You still hear it to this day, and you'll hear it after this day as well. It's another sort of conspiracy consensus that's been created after the sort of hijacker story began to fall apart. And then the video fakery argument has been used to cover up technology. What technology? Some type of image projection technology that they've also got, which works quite well, but it's not perfect. And I think this technology didn't give a perfect reproduction of a plane because some people didn't see the plane. So from where they were standing or where they were filming, there's very few that didn't pick it up on film, actually, although there's a few videos which have claimed to show no plane on the crash. Some people didn't see it because the image projection technology isn't perfect. So depending on where you were standing, the light and so forth, it looks like there was a chance that you may not have seen a coherent image. And that explains why, to me at least, why some of the videos show a sort of silvery coloured plane, a light coloured plane, and some show a dark coloured plane. Because depending on where the video is shot from, you got a different look, a different appearance of the plane, because the image projection technology wasn't perfect. So that is what I think is how they've managed the perception of 9/11, and it's been a huge success, because most people talk about CGI or plane crashes or bombs in the building, and very few will tell you what I've just told you.
What happened quickly between, was it you and Richard Gage? Did you have like a bit of a spat or an argument? Or
Well, I've never spoken to him personally, but the point about Richard Gage is, much as Simon Shack, Richard Gage claims to be a 9/11 truther. In other words, he points out that the official story of 9/11 is false, and of course, based on what I've just told everybody, I agree with that. But he then took forward, in other words, to just give you a little bit of a timeline. I won't go into great length here, obviously, because we've been on this a long time now. But Jones, basically, when we started talking about the cold fusion links, and other people as well, it wasn't just us, but it was probably primarily us, he kind of faded off the scene. And the scholars group kind of just faded away, this 9/11 scholars group. So they needed another entity to suck people in. And that entity was the Architects and Engineers group. And that domain name was registered and their website became active very close to the time that Dr. Judy Wood's court case started. So we thought that was another distraction exercise that they created. And Gage started doing talks and saying, we know that it was controlled demolition and the buildings were brought down with explosives. And there's explicit statements about that in their so-called mission statements of the time. So I knew from the get-go in 2007, I was already clued in enough by then to know that Richard Gage was a liar, basically. He was a liar. He was deliberately misleading people, just as Jones was, but he was doing it in a slightly different way. And then it became clearer in 2011 when another chap who supported Richard Gage, called Matthew Nouse, who ran a group in Milwaukee, I think it was, he actually helped organise talks for Richard Gage in 2011. It was 2011. For his Architects and Engineers group. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth is no such thing, by the way. And then he showed Richard Gage Dr. Judy Wood's book, because Matthew Nouse had a copy. Matthew Nouse watched Richard Gage's reaction. He started laughing at this book, but he wanted a copy. And I have a copy of a check signed by Richard Gage. It's on my website, paying for a copy of Dr. Judy Wood's book. Where did the towers go? I've got a copy of that. It's on my website. I've got a copy of the contents page where it lists the subheadings where Dr. Wood talks about thermite. She talks about bombs in the building. She talks about buildings collapsing. It's on the contents page of her book. Yet Richard Gage has continued to claim publicly that Dr. Judy Wood ignores that evidence. No, she doesn't. It's in her book. So Mr. Gage, like Simon Shack, is a bald-faced liar. Now, I've never had the opportunity to call him that to his face, but it's been on my website for 5 years, and I've done several presentations like this. He's never picked me up on it because he knows that it's true. I know that it's true because I've got the evidence which proves that it's true. He has a copy of the book. Are you telling me he's got a copy of that book and he hasn't read the contents page? If he has, what does he think he's doing? Why is he, if he's leading a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, why is he not looking at the forensic evidence that's in that book that's been taken to a court of law? Why is he not doing that? It's basically, the point is, he has no escape. He has no escape from that situation. So anybody that promotes Richard Gage anywhere on Facebook, on the internet, they are promoting a CIA-run disinformation campaign. And I've written more about that, again, in my second free book about 9/11 research called 9/11 Holding the Truth. Download those. There's audio book versions of those, all on my website, all free. I put everything that I know in there, the research that I've been involved in now for over 12 years. So anybody that wants to get all the gory and occasionally, well, often boring details, actually, it's all in there for anybody who wants to find that out. It's all public. Nobody's asked me to take it off. Nobody's asked me to take it down because it's all true. As far, I mean, I'm saying that, so you have to check for yourself whether I'm telling the truth or not.
Okay. Well, we've been going for a while, so what we'll do is we'll end it there if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Happy to talk for as long as you need me to talk, and we can certainly end it there. And yeah,
and I'll talk to you off camera anyways. But cheers for coming on. Hopefully we can do this again and maybe go into more information on sort of the towers and the dustification and the sort of evidence supporting around that. That'd be quite cool.
Sure. And as I say, if anybody wants to contact me, just go to checktheevidence.com, click on the contact, and you can get to me that way.
I'll get you to send over your link to your website and put them all in the description box anyways for anyone that wants to come check you out and contact you. But yeah, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.